Hello, my name is Deven Philbrick, and I'm delighted to be here today with novelist, essayist, and short story writer Katherine Hill. Ms. Hill is MCLA's Hardman Creative Writer in Residence for Spring 2016. She is with us for 2 days, during which time she has been sitting in on classes and meeting with students, and will be giving a public reading tonight at Gallery 51 at 7 p.m. This residency and others like it are made possible through generous funding by Hardman Special Initiatives and are facilitated and directed by MCLA's English Communications Department. Katherine Hill was born in Washington, D.C., and is a graduate of Yale University and holds an MFA from the Bennington Writing Seminars. Her work has been published in, among many other places, The Believer, Book Forum, the Colorado Review, The Common, The Guardian, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Her debut novel, The Violet Hour, published by Scribner in 2013, begins with the destruction of a marriage and explores the complexities of familial and romantic love. Katherine, welcome.
Thank you, Deven.
So as a point of entry for our discussion today, I wanted to bring out a particular line in the story that in the novel rather, that just destroyed me.
Okay.
It destroyed me with its poignancy, its sadness, its economy, and its miraculous ability to encapsulate what I perceive to be the governing emotional concerns of the novel. The sentence appears when Abe and Cassandra Green are still young and they're still newlyweds, and Abe's grandmother, who raised him, has just died, and Cassandra offers her affection as a kind of condolence, and Abe rebuffs her. And as she slinks back to their bedroom, rejected, the line reads, "It had never occurred to her he would ever not want her love." And I nearly dropped the book when I read this line.
Well, thank you.
It's magnificent, and for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is because it forces us to ask what I think is the central question of the novel, which is, given the ephemerality of love, the ephemerality of life, the ephemerality of human contact, how can we stitch together these disparate ephemera to construct a lasting experience of another human being? And so I guess this is a convoluted way of asking you why or what is the origin of your work's preoccupation with not unrequited love, but love no longer needed or love no longer wanted? Do you consider that the subject of this book? And if so,
Yeah.
why did you choose it as your subject?
Well, you're a very careful reader, so it's certainly a subject. I think you gave a great argument for it there. So I can't deny it. You know. Yeah, I think I'm just very interested in knowing other people. I always have been as a human being. I've really enjoyed making friends and deepening my relationships with people in my family, and so I think fiction is kind of just another version of that. You know, it's a way of getting to know other people. So I invented the people, so obviously I know them from Adam. You know, but there's a wonderful process in creating a character and putting characters in action together that enables you to go deep with them. And so inevitably, when you get to know a person very well, or you get to know a character very well, you learn their limits. And so I was actually I thought I was more interested in testing the limits of these people. How far could they go towards intimacy? How far could they go towards need and desire? So that was, among the many things I was thinking about over the course of the many years I took to write this book. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that you talk about liking knowing people, because this novel contains so many diverse characters, and you're really closely engaging with every one of them, whether it's Abe, Cassandra, Elizabeth, their daughter, the grandparents. There are just so many characters, and we get to know each one of them, and each one of them works in his or her own specific way and has his or her own specific voice. And so I'm curious about what the process of occupying a character and taking on that voice is.
So that's a fun thing. We were actually talking about this in a class yesterday, in Jen Auger's class, about whether when you write a character, the question was put to me, do I become that character, or am I just kind of a really good friend of that character, describing who that character is? And I think it is a little bit of both. But certainly when you write in a third person close perspective or a first person perspective, as I really like to do. I tend to put on the costume of the character and really become the character. And that's, I think, part of why multiple perspective storytelling is so appealing to me, because I get to change roles. I get to play a father and a mother and a daughter, or a husband and a wife, and and so I think that that's very appealing, because one person's perspective is never the end of the story. It's always just one take on the story. So what's fun for me as the writer and as someone creating experience for a reader is to get us going pretty far along with one character so that we think that's the world, that's how it is, and then to just switch and give the other side and see that there were some truths that were held by the first character that might not be true to the second character, and yet both are true, right. And how maddening that is. So.
And these truths that you're talking about evolve over time.
Yeah.
Because we're with a character as she's a young person, and then we're with a character in her middle age.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering about what that process is like of inhabiting the same person but in different historical moments within the person's life.
Yeah, that's a real draw for me for fiction. It's maybe one of the original reasons I ever set out to write fiction, because I'm so interested in the lifespan. I love life narratives, like the story of a person from birth to death, and all that is encountered there. Is so fascinating to me, and there's a little bit of a sense of omnipotence. If I've created this person and I can watch over this whole life, there's great power in that, but there's also great responsibility, right? As they say, Spider-Man says. So I think the moments of knowing a character when they're young inform the moments of knowing them when they're older, and it also is just really interesting to see the ways in which certain turns that could have been taken don't get taken, and then just exploring a character all throughout her life.
And I imagine that this requires a tremendous amount of planning. I'm thinking about the sort of architecture of the novel in respect to, well, the novel begins with a prologue in which a marriage is destroyed, and then chapter 1 begins with a wedding.
Yeah.
And so we have these sort of ironic positionings of scenes throughout the entire novel, and I suppose I'm wondering what the process of actually being the architect behind that is like.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. The first scene of this novel, which is sort of a catastrophic fight on a boat, and is a literal unraveling of a marriage. It happens, the action of that scene is the end of the marriage. That was my first scene. I wrote it first. I rewrote it many, many times, but it was always the scene from which this book originated. And the writing of the book was kind of my challenge. After what happens after that? So this happens, then what? And so, I took many false turns in my explorations, but I always knew that there would need to be some, as you put it, some arrangement of scenes that caused us to reflect back on that first one. So as you say, the marriage is the very next scene, but that's 8 years later, and it's happening to a character who is not quite as important to the story as our three main characters. But I knew, in a novel about the end of a marriage, there had to be a wedding, and in a novel that's about funerals, there had to be, so a funeral home is a major setting for this novel.
Right.
There would have to be a death. So I think our subject matter often determines the types of scenes that we write, and I think I had to follow some of those guiding principles for this book.
And you partition this scene off in a prologue.
Yeah.
What's behind the choice there? Is it just because you wrote it first and it was sort of in a separate space for you, or was there something more cerebral going on there?
Well, as I think I said, I was really interested in. I have always been, as a writer, very interested in the passage of time over lifetimes, and so that prologue is a separate scene because it happens 8 years before the major action of the book. So I wanted it to be bracketed in that way. So it's a great moment that's indelibly imprinted on the memory of the three characters. They're always going to look back at that moment from their perspectives going forward. And I thought it had a certain kind of dramatic unity to tell it, in this confined space, and to kind of ratchet up all the emotions for these three people, where they would say kind of the worst possible things to each other, and then have to go back to living a life with each other or not.
Though the novel, for the most part, is a personal novel about family and love, there's a significant political dimension to the novel because Hurricane Katrina is taking place during the novel, and it sort of acts as a kind of a backdrop to the action of the novel, and the characters have a tendency to reflect on their own insignificance in respect to the events of Hurricane Katrina. And so I'm wondering about the thought process behind integrating personal tragedy with public tragedy. Where were you when you wrote that in terms of your thinking?
So it's interesting. I found myself writing the present day scenes in the novel, the kind of contemporary part of the novel is 2005 in that summer. And I had written a number of scenes in that time before I realized that Hurricane Katrina happened at this time. Like, if I'm going to think about the historical narrative, sort of the history. Actually, if I were going to write about something in 2005, I couldn't avoid Hurricane Katrina, and it felt metaphorically relevant, actually, to discuss it, because we had that opening scene on a boat, and we had a lot of discussion of water between the three characters, and so I thought, okay, this actually kind of makes sense thematically. And I also really liked it because I think it is a story of failure, individual failure to connect, within a family. And that's one kind of failure, but there are a lot of other kinds of failure that we're all implicated in nationally within our communities. And Hurricane Katrina is a just colossal instance of national failure. And so how interesting to juxtapose that, I thought, with the failure of a family, a small failure, but that nonetheless is enormous to them, Right. So.
Yeah, there are so many literary echoes in this novel. I'm wondering if you could speak at all to who the writers who influence you most are.
Yeah, I mean, everyone I've ever read, right? But
right, I know that's such an impossible question to answer.
Yeah, but for me, so I grew up on Shakespeare for whatever reason. Given who my parents were, and they took me to the theater a lot, and I had a kind of dramatic sensibility as a kid. So I definitely have The Tempest as an influence in this book. In fact, we open with a metaphorical shipwreck, which The Tempest also does. So that was definitely a sort of a guiding thematic work for me. But the other writers who have influenced me in terms of style or in terms of subject matter or tone or what their kind of project overall might seem to be would certainly be Virginia Woolf, who, when I first encountered her in college, I thought she was a revelation to me, that a person could write like this, that everything suddenly felt possible. So she's certainly an influence. And among contemporary writers, I'm a great fan of Laurie Moore and Zadie Smith and Jennifer Egan. And also a great many writers who write in very compressed style. Lydia Davis, who writes these very, very short pieces, prose poems basically, and they're often kind of games, but so very different from the kind of writing that I do. But I think her control of language is so admirable, and the ways in which large questions can be opened up by the smallest amount of words. It's very compelling to me. So.
Most of those influences are detectable in the novel, but
thanks.
not in an homage kind of way. So it's very effective in that way.
Thank you.
One of the central ironies of the novel, and I'm not even 100% sure in what way this is ironic, but it feels ironic to me, is the presence of the funeral home, and that a death takes place outside of a funeral home, where these children and eventually adults are face to face with dead bodies so often, and the last name of the family, Fabricant, I'm not really sure what to do with that, but it felt, as I was reading the novel, to kind of govern the experience of the novel in an important way. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, in a way I sort of, well, I guess I should start with, the literal inspiration, which for me, so my mother grew up in a funeral home outside Chicago, and I saw my first body on a beer when I was quite young by accident. My cousins and I were trying to play tag in the parlor, the chapel, which we often did. And somehow we didn't tell any grown-ups, and we just ended up downstairs where there was a viewing, or a body ready for viewing. And I think my cousin had probably seen it before because her father was the undertaker at the time, or the funeral director at the time. But I didn't live nearby, and I rarely went to my grandmother's house, you know, for periodic visits. So it was very shocking to me. And I kind of always knew I would write about a funeral home in some way. It's not really autobiographical because it's just, it's in my life, but not of my life, if that makes sense. So it really is fully realized as fiction in this book. But, you know, I knew I needed a funeral home. I needed to, you know, explore some fears and things there. But then I also really sort of see this book as kind of a death of the American family story. So when you have institutions that are dying and relationships that are dying, it's very tempting to juxtapose them with like literal death and literal bodies. So so that became quite easy to connect, I thought.
One of the things that was most compelling to me about the novel, the sort of content of the novel aside, and the gripping emotional story that's going on, is the close work that you do with language. There are really a lot of beautiful sentences in this novel. I read one at the beginning, but I'm curious about how much work you do in terms of this word or that word, and focusing purely on sentences as opposed to big ideas. Which comes first for you, the language or the idea, or do they come inextricably linked to each other?
I think the idea or the situation comes first, but it's very vague, you know. Like with that first scene, okay, husband, wife, daughter, boat, disaster. Like that's first. And then the language emerges from that. So, but the language tells the story. You know, I feel that so strongly. The language takes the story in places that I wouldn't have expected on first draft. And then in revision, consistency within the world of the language is really important, you know, keeping metaphors that feel right for the story and getting rid of ones that feel like from some other story. So I think they work hand in hand, and I certainly toggle back and forth between, you know, remembering the major questions that I had, the big ideas that drew me in, and working it out on the page, you know, in language.
Do you write every day?
No, I do not. I wish to. I hate to admit that I don't, but it's hard, you know, when you're traveling or you have family events, or, you know, you just can't do it sometimes. So I don't. But I've gotten more comfortable admitting that because I think it's actually reassuring to a lot of people who think, oh no, writing every day, you know, maybe they could brush their teeth every day, but probably not anything else, you know? So I don't think you have to, but it certainly is harder to write again when you have not been writing regularly. So I try to make it as regular as possible.
And so is there another novel in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on a second. Yep. And yeah, it's about a football player. I can't say much more, but yeah, I'm very excited about it.
All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Okay. I wanted to ask one final question to close the interview, which is probably a question you get all of the time. but what advice would you give to young up-and-coming writers who consider you an icon or something?
Write every day. No, I'm kidding. You know, I think, I do advise a quality that I think someone who likes you might call patience, and someone who doesn't like you might call stubbornness. A certain kind of perseverance, a certain kind of fortitude. If you want to write, just write. And read as widely as you can, and go to the movies as often as you can, you know, engage with narrative and storytelling as much as possible. And if you make that your kind of daily life, you will write, you know. So,
well,
thank
Katherine,
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Deven.